You're in the waterloop. Waterloop.
This is a Pass the Mic episode where I turn the Waterloop podcast over to a guest host. This is Waterloop episode number 128, Inside Illinois' Lead Legislation. Illinois is the state with the most lead service lines for drinking water in the country, estimated to be between 700,000 and 1.4 million, with a large number of those found in Chicago. But in 2021, the efforts of a diverse coalition of stakeholders led to passage of landmark legislation that made Illinois one of only 2 states to require replacement of all lead service lines. An inside look at the Illinois legislation is provided in this Pass the Mic episode, which is guest hosted by Jeremy Orr, an environmental attorney specializing in Safe Drinking Water Act enforcement, who previously worked at the Natural Resources Defense Council and now is at Earthjustice. Jeremy talks with Justin Williams of the Metropolitan Planning Council in Chicago about the problem of lead service lines, the disproportionate impact on communities of color, the extensive work it took to pass the legislation, and expected benefits for people and the economy. Before starting the conversation, a few quick reminders. Waterloop is a nonprofit media outlet that depends on a variety of support. That includes you as a listener. If you value Waterloop's content, consider making a contribution through Patreon. Visit patreon.com/thewaterloop. Waterloop is made possible in part by a grant from Spring Point Partners. Waterloop is also sponsored by Hydroloop, a company that is revolutionizing gray water recycling in homes and businesses. Learn how to use water twice at hydroloop.com. And now I've got to pass the mic.
Welcome to Waterloop. My name is Jeremy Orr, and I'm the guest host for this episode. I'm an environmental lawyer who mainly works on Safe Drinking Water Act enforcement. I've spent the last few years at Natural Resources Defense Council as a senior attorney working on lead in drinking water. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Justin Williams of the Metropolitan Planning Council in Chicago, Illinois. And we're going to spend some time today talking about some work that we engaged in together, passing landmark legislation to replace all the lead service lines in the state of Illinois. Justin, want to give a little intro and a little background about yourself and your work?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Jeremy. Really excited to be here. Really happy to be talking about this important issue. As Jeremy said, my name is Justin Williams, and I work at the Metropolitan Planning Council in Chicago, Illinois. We are an 87-year-old planning and infrastructure policy organization working in Chicago and Illinois. We work across a variety of infrastructure issues, including water infrastructure, transportation, land use and planning, housing, community development. And I was really excited to be working with Jeremy and many other partners on the lead service line replacement legislation that was passed this year in Illinois.
Thank you. And again, thanks, Justin, for joining me for this conversation. I think we engaged in some really meaningful work with a number of our, kind of colleagues on the ground and local community partners. And, we're able to get this, kind of bill over the hill and to share just a little bit of history of, lead in drinking water in particular in Illinois, or not history, but just even facts for that matter. Illinois is known to have the most lead service lines of any state in the country. We have the city of Chicago that has the most lead service lines. So of any city, in the country, somewhere near around 400,000 estimated. We've seen estimates for Illinois to be near, around 700,000, but estimated to potentially be above 1 million lead service lines. So we're talking a lot of lead pipes bringing, lead contaminated drinking water to people's homes throughout the state, right? So it's no small issue by any means, right? And I think part of that, which we've known, is a city like Chicago had allowed for the use of lead service lines all the way through 1986, right? And this was in the context of of lead being, a known poison, this is like fairly recent, right? So we know there were communities around the country that stopped using lead, long before the city of Chicago stopped using it. Not only, allowed for the use of, the city of Chicago actually mandated it till 1986. So when we think about why there are so many lead pipes in the ground in Chicago and Illinois, as opposed to many other places, it's because of this required use of it. But to talk a bit more about the scope of that problem in Illinois, Justin, you want to share some about that?
Sure, yeah, happy to. So, as Jeremy mentioned, Illinois has more lead service lines than any other state in the country. I should say more known lead service lines than any other state in the country. There may be states with more, but we just don't know yet. That's possible. But to put a point on that, Illinois has over 675,000 known lead service lines in the state, and additionally up to 1 million service lines of an unknown material composition that could, in fact, be made of lead-based materials. Those communities with lead service lines are distributed really across the state, from the most southernmost part of the state up to the border with Wisconsin. But we do also know that lead service lines appear to be more concentrated in communities with high percentages of people of color living in them. So I think that gives you some sense of just how big of a problem we're dealing with here in Illinois.
And Justin, why is, it's crazy that needs to be asked, right? But I think it's an important question. Like, why is lead in drinking water so bad?
Sure, yeah. So, so lead is a pretty well-known and potent neurotoxin. We've known this for a long time. I've actually even seen some recent research that suggests ancient Romans knew about lead poisoning, which is maybe no surprise given that they were using lead in their plumbing supplies really at that point. But anyway, I digress. Lead is a pretty nasty material, right? And drinking water is one possible known exposure for lead. The thing is that lead doesn't leave the treatment plant. It doesn't usually come out of the water supply with a bunch of lead in it. Oftentimes, it's introduced through plumbing systems as it travels throughout the water infrastructure system. We can be exposed to lead in our drinking water through what's known as a lead service line. And a service line is a pipe that carries water to your home from the water main running underneath the street, right? So if you want to picture a service line as a straw that connects the tap in your home to the water main running under the street, that's what a service line is. And that can be made of lead-based materials. When they are made of lead-based materials, as you can imagine, that can introduce lead into the drinking water system. And there's some evidence that they can contribute up to 75% of lead in drinking water when it's present.
One of the things that really stood out to me about, the dangers of lead in drinking water and lead service lines was the disproportionate impact that it had on particular communities, right? And we've known that, drinking water, lack of access to drinking water and affordability of drinking water kind of disproportionately impacts certain communities. I know I had a colleague at NRDC that produced a report named Waterjustice that looked at the disproportionate, impacts of Safe Drinking Water Act violations, particularly in communities of color. So not that, didn't necessarily only look at lead, but it looked at, violations in terms of contamination. It looked at how long these violations went without being fixed, right? Or what particular communities were more likely to be hit with contaminated water and so on. So you talk a bit about the communities that may have been disproportionate, or may be still, right, disproportionately impacted by lead in drinking water and lead service lines in Illinois.
Sure, yeah. So in November of 2020, MPC released some research on the disproportionate effect or the disproportionate distribution of lead service lines in communities of color. And, as Jeremy mentioned, I think we've observed that a lot of the big lead in drinking water crises that have happened in the United States have happened in predominantly African American communities. So if we think about communities like Newark and Washington, D.C. and Flint, right, these are communities with large proportions of African Americans living in them. And so we wanted to see whether we could confirm if something similar was happening in Illinois. And what we did is we looked at where lead service lines were distributed throughout the state. And we tried to identify, okay, what are the demographic characteristics of those communities? And what we found is when you look at the 50 communities with the most known lead service lines in Illinois, you see that they contain 95% of the state's known lead service lines. And they also include a disproportionate percentage of the state's Black and Latinx residents. Let me put that in a slightly different way. Illinois' Black and Latinx populations are twice as likely as white Illinoisans to be living in one of these communities that contains nearly all of the state's known lead service lines. 65% of the state's Black and Latinx populations are living in those communities. Meanwhile, only 30% of the state's white population are living in those same communities. And I think what that demonstrates is that, among the lead service lines that we know about, our state's Black and Latinx populations are much more likely to be living in communities that contain that infrastructure.
So how does that happen, right? And I think that's an important question, right? If we know, lead service lines were the normal practice to be used around the country and even throughout Illinois up to a certain point, right? How was it? So if we know they were pretty much being used everywhere, right, throughout the state and particularly throughout the region, the Chicagoland region, how do we end up with the fact that, we are in, 2022 and, the overwhelming majority of these, lead service lines are in the communities of color, but not in, wealthier, kind of white communities. Like how does that happen?
Yeah, that's a $1 million question, and I can try to take a stab at maybe one answer, which I think part of it has something to do with legacy infrastructure and where that's distributed, right? So the communities that have known lead service lines were pretty universally built before 1987, right? A large percent of the housing stock was built before 1987, because that's when Congress banned the use of lead-based plumbing. And when you look at where the state's people of color are primarily located, they're located in those legacy communities. Part of that story is probably about white flight, right? So as we saw white residents leave for the suburbs, they left behind aging infrastructure, and nobody cleaned up the mess. There was no funding to remove lead service lines. And so today's residents are dealing with decisions of, politicians, decision makers from 50 years ago, 60 years ago, right? So I think that's probably part of the story. I don't know, Jeremy, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I think that's right. I think that's a significant portion of it, right? And two, right? I think oftentimes when we have these conversations about infrastructure, it's hard to have any of these kind of conversations around environmental decision making without invoking kind of environmental justice and environmental racism, right? So I think when we think about the history of racism and white flight and especially urban cores, right, where we're finding so many of these lead service lines, like it would make sense. And the other piece too, which I tend to think about is where infrastructure investments for the last 30 or 40 years have been made, right? So particularly communities that also probably had lead service lines at some point, having their infrastructure, their crumbling, poisonous infrastructure replaced, much sooner, right, than low income communities and communities of color. So that tends to be, also one of the things that comes to mind is beyond just the legacy portion of it is who does live in these communities and who's getting money, who's getting the infrastructure upgrades and who's not getting them. And I think that's a very real portion of it as well. and then with that too, like thinking about like these disproportionate impacts as we begin to kind of dig into the Illinois work and the passage of that bill. Like one of the things that comes to mind when I think about like the way this work of advocating for clean drinking water around the country, and in particular around lead in drinking water, as you pointed out. Many of the communities that we see, we've seen in the media and in the news that have faced these crises, right? You talked about Flint, right? There was, we've had the New Jersey, the Newark, water crisis, and dealing with lead in drinking water, and we're seeing this, this Benton Harbor, again, lead in drinking water crisis as well. Predominantly, low income Black communities. One of the things that stood out to me about the work in Illinois was like the way things move and the way things get done is by these constituencies like actually showing up and holding their elected and appointed officials accountable. And but that means like having a broad coalition of impacted community members and other folks to kind of show up. So could you talk a bit about just the coalition that we were able to build out to begin to even get to even make this an issue and make this a concern in Illinois?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so a few of the key players, right? And I think this was a big communal effort, as you point out, but a few of the key players that I think were really critical to the success of this bill were, environmental justice groups in and around the region, the Chicago region, the faith community. We had people who work in the faith community who are concerned with workforce development and equitable distribution of environmental goods and bads. More conventional environmental groups, civic groups like the Metropolitan Planning Council, public health advocates, children's advocates. Labor was certainly involved too and was a big piece of this. And our fantastic, legislative sponsors who really wanted to see this work get done. They were the ones who carried this bill. They were the ones who made it happen. And I think everyone working together to really address this issue was an important part of the success of this effort.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Kind of having been plugged into like this work in kind of two phases, like we kind of split up. There was this, there was movement on this years ago, right? Like more than 5 years ago when before we first started like really coming together and working on. There had been movement on it, and folks had tried to coalesce around getting action on this, right? And for one reason or another, that kind of consistently failed or kind of consistently been put on the back burner whenever it was, whenever they felt like it was time to move on it. And then, right in these last couple of years, this coalition came together. It was built out in a way that like was really reflective of impacted community, right? Reflective of in environmental advocates who have a stake in clean drinking water, as you mentioned, reflective of labor, right? Who stands to benefit greatly when we think about the economic benefits of this, which I love to hear you talk about in a little bit as well, in particular the economic benefits of this bill. But yeah, it felt like this diverse coalition of supporters like really began to move this in a way that we hadn't seen it move before. And for me, I think that's I think that set the groundwork for how we began to get like real action on it. Because I mentioned, right, this bill had been proposed in some draft form by, maybe different legislators or maybe different coalitions, or different versions of the coalition, but it hadn't really got action. And for me, it felt like that's what kind of set the stage to prompt like actual action on it, was like this diverse group of folks coming together and working with stakeholders that we don't normally work with too, right? I think that was the thing. Even though we didn't always agree, we were working, with and engaging with, the municipal league, right, and engaging with the American Water Works Association chapters in Illinois. So there were folks who we don't always agree with on issues, particularly on water infrastructure and how to fix these issues. But like they were actually at the table, and stayed at the table and worked through these issues in a meaningful way. But I don't know if you have other thoughts on like what was it that really helped us get traction on this to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say something similar, and I'm glad you brought up, some of the other stakeholders who were involved in this and were really critical to the success of this. Like, there's no way we would have gotten this done without being in regular conversation with our municipal representation, the municipal league, as well as our water utility professionals in the state. I think having them involved, having that conversation with them, and as you say, we didn't always agree, right? But I think we ultimately got to a place where this bill could move forward. And I think that was a really, really critical piece of this, just like understanding that, taking those stakeholders' input seriously and really trying to work with them, I think was really critical.
And building on that, right? Because I mentioned, like, we didn't always agree, even in the midst of negotiating and trying to get something meaningful passed. We had our share of disagreements, with other stakeholders. What would you say was probably the biggest challenge to getting this over the hill?
I think one thing that was a big challenge was trying to identify a funding source to get this work done, right? Like, we know that there are communities in Illinois who are going to need financial assistance in getting this work done. And in the end, I think we just, it was a challenge to identify a funding source that was really going to work for everyone. And I think that was kind of a point that required a lot of work. And ultimately we didn't get to it. Gratefully, the federal government is obviously working really diligently to provide a lot of that funding, and that's going to be really huge in Illinois.
Yeah, I think that's right. That felt like the biggest, kind of one of the biggest sticking points in those negotiations, kind of early on, right? Because it was interesting because it was an issue of saying it's especially hearing from municipalities and political leaders who are going to be responsible for doing the work, right? And utilities who are responsible for figuring this out is it was expensive, right? And it started off as we need a funding source, and then we found a funding source, and then it was like, well, we don't want that funding source. It's like, well, we gotta you gotta have something. I think we pitched a couple of different ideas, and it became rather clear that, okay, like, is there a way that we can at least and the way we resolved it, right, is putting the ball back in their court to say, okay, you can figure out the funding source, right? Like, you can figure out, and there's this advisory committee that, and we can probably pause for a second, Justin. You can share a bit about like what's actually in the bill. Like, I don't want the conversation to go on.
Sure.
It's not described. Like, actually, because it's some pretty significant stuff in the bill. Like, we got some significant stuff passed, right? So I would love you to touch on that, just maybe some of the bullet points of, what we got out of that. But to that point, it was saying, okay, you know what, you can, the ball's in your court. You can figure out funding, but we were able to put some kind of pieces in place and some restrictions to say, this is, you can figure it out, but doing it in a way that's equitable, doing it in a way that doesn't put the burden solely on, homeowners who, by the way, in many cases didn't install, these lead pipes or didn't opt for them. They were required to in many instances, right, to do so. But yeah, I think that funding piece was a really tough sticking point. I mean, I remember those. We were meeting multiple times a week with a stakeholder group of like 70. We're literally like 70 people were on these calls, and we finally broke down into a smaller group and said, okay, like, what do we need to get over the hump? And it was that giving them that authority to say, this is how we'll figure it out, and we'll do it in a way that doesn't strap homeowners with it. But with that, like, I'd love to. You share a bit about like why was this bill so important? Why was it so big? Because the thing is, it was at the time it was only the second mandate passed in the country, and I believe it's still the third. I know Michigan had passed, or Michigan had did it through rulemaking shortly after the Flint water crisis. It was ours, and then was it New Jersey?
New Jersey, yeah,
passed it maybe about a month after our bill had passed. So. Would love to hear about like what the components of the bill that really made this important and that are actually really the meat of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll say, and this is a good tie-in. I think one of the things that allowed the bill to really succeed is that we were all committed to doing this in a way that worked for communities, right? That was possible and was not, placing an unmanageable burden on the state's water utility to do this work while still providing some discrete timelines and some motivation to get the work done. And I think that was a really key component of doing this. In terms of what's in the bill, I mean, at its heart, right, it requires every utility to find and replace every lead service line in the state on some discrete timeframes. Those timeframes vary depending on how many lead service lines a community has in its inventory. So if your community has, fewer than 10,000 lead service lines, I believe you have 17 years to replace all of them. If you have more than, say, 100,000, so that's only one community in the state, which is the city of Chicago, you have 50 years to replace all your lead service lines. And it varies in between depending on how many lead service lines are in your community. And so that, I think, is an important sort of feasibility component. We recognize that some communities are just going to need more time than others to replace their lead service lines. It also bans partial lead service line replacement, which is a dangerous practice that we were very happy to see no longer be legal in the state of Illinois as of January 1st of this year. What a partial lead service line replacement is utilities in the past have sometimes replaced only the portion of the lead service line that runs from the water main to the curb, right? And they've done this in order to save costs, or perhaps because they couldn't get access to a homeowner's property, or any number of other reasons, right? Unfortunately, what that does is it can actually disturb settled lead particles that are in the lead service line and flush them into the drinking water system, and it can really elevate and spike lead levels in drinking water. And so we made it a centerpiece, really, of this legislation that partial lead service line replacements are no longer allowed in the state of Illinois. Additionally, it creates a grant program that will prioritize low-income, high-need communities for lead service line replacement. As we continue to advocate for funding for lead service line replacement in the state of Illinois, that will likely be the grant program that is made eligible. Jeremy, what am I missing? There's a lot in that bill.
Yeah,
contracting requirements.
Yep. There's some. Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing. I think it also I think requires, and I think it was starting beginning of this year, January 1st as well. To when they're doing water main replacements, you also have to replace it alongside, replace the lead service lines alongside water main replacement. Because one of the things that we've seen is, as Justin mentioned, right, utilities will undertake whole projects. In particular, we saw with the city of Chicago undertook a 10-year capital improvement project to replace nearly 100 miles or more of water main, right, and didn't replace the lead service lines alongside of it. So making sure that's being done. Creates this lead service line advisory board, right, which will be filled with individuals who represent certain stakeholder groups. So there's like an environmental justice spot on there, an environmental organization spot on their community spot. So this advisory group will kind of give stakeholder recommendations to the state on how to carry out this work. And one piece that I think was really important was, which we were able to get in the bill, was we established a statewide low-income water assistance program, right? And it may not have been directly connected to the work of lead service line replacement, but when we think about water infrastructure and the cost and affordability of water as a whole, water assistance was critical, and that was actually the first, the first statewide program to be created in the country to provide for some sort of water assistance, which I believe will be kind of created through a rulemaking process eventually.
couple other ones that I forgot. Those are good ones. So there are workforce equity and contracting equity provisions in the bill. It requires every utility to make a good faith effort to utilize minority women business enterprises, and it also defines what good faith effort means. So that, I think, was an important contracting equity provision. Additionally, it requires every utility to create a plan for lead service line replacement, right? I mean, one of the things that we've noticed in MPC's work is that there are utilities who don't know the scope of the problem in their utility area, right? Like they haven't done the inventory. And number two, even if they had done the inventory, they may not have a plan on how to address it and how to prioritize high-risk facilities like childcare centers and schools in the replacement of lead service lines. So these are another couple important provisions that are in there, really to make sure that residents' health is protected and utilities have the sort of clear signposts that they need in order to get this work done.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you mentioned, especially in terms of the workforce development provisions, were which ended up, I think, playing a critical part in the passage of this bill, was just the economic development that that we stood to see from this. Could you share a bit about just like what some of those numbers look like, some of the projected numbers of economic benefit to the state and to workers, where this bill to get passed. And it's important because I began seeing this analysis of economic benefit show up in the federal conversation, right? So at the same time, we were kind of hashing this out, and we've kind of talked about this, right? There were a lot of things outside of our control that just really helped, kind of blow the doors open for this opportunity. And one of them I kept seeing was, state or our U.S. Senator, Tammy Duckworth was really pushing on this. Was kind of negotiations of infrastructure, really pushing, Congress on funding for lead service line replacement, and she would, oftentimes quote Illinois numbers and Chicago numbers, and I began to see this these economic benefits pop up in federal conversations, and this particularly for Illinois. So if you could share about what some of those projections were.
Sure. Yeah. So, we did some analysis of the economic benefits of lead service line replacement, and we found that replacing Illinois' lead service lines would create up to $1.15 billion in economic activity every year and sustain up to 11,000 jobs per year. I mean, and this is consistent with a lot of infrastructure development work, right? Like we've seen pretty consistently that investing in our infrastructure is a real economic engine. And so we were really happy to see that included to see dedicated lead service line replacement funding included in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Because not only is it going to address this major public health looming crisis, but it also is going to create economic activity at a time when it's badly needed.
Yeah, and building on that, right, kind of the economic benefits that were being lifted up in Illinois, and then kind of being lifted up in national conversations by our elected officials. What were some of the other kind of key things that just happened, right? They just happened because they happened, and like they say, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, right? But I think we got some, as we were working on this, I think we were well prepared, right? But I think we got some unexpected help from a few different areas in terms of just kind of political dynamics and conversations that were taking place that just really helped us get over the hill. So you want to talk a bit about those too?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think a big part of why this issue got so much traction in 2021 was because the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus really got behind it, and they saw this issue as a racial equity issue, and really picked it up and made sure that it was part of the conversation in the 2021 legislative cycle. And I think that's fantastic, and it was really like there's no I think that was just a critical component of this that really, we had some control over, in the sense that, or some preparation for, in the sense that we had done this analysis of like, okay, what is the racially disparate impact of lead service line distribution in Illinois, right? And I think that helped to make that case. Um, uh, and I think that the Black Caucus, the legislative Black Caucus in Illinois, has been a strong force in Illinois politics for a long time, and I think the murder of George Floyd and the real, I think, national conversation around the need for racial justice, racial equity, I think added to that power. And so I think when the legislative Black Caucus made that part of their agenda, I think that was a really strong endorsement. I don't know. What do you think, Jeremy? What were some of the other things you noticed?
No, I think that's right. I think the Black Caucus agenda, like that, because the way it kind of played out, if you recall, we kind of had two shots at it, right? But we knew the last one was kind of going to be the big one. We got contacted by the Black Caucus kind of over Christmas break, right? It was kind of nearing the end of a session, kind of closing out a session, and ultimately it ended up getting passed in the next session. We decided to hold off on it, but I mean, it came up there, right? And they kind of reached out, like, hey, we want to make this part of our agenda. And I don't think it was on any of our radar, right? We had looked up and it had been introduced. An older form of it had been introduced. And at that point, we had kind of been working to redraft it to be more equitable. And that's what we did. We said, hey, this is great. Keep it as part of your agenda, but let us, take some time to figure out how to do this right and do it equitably, right? And get a updated version of the bill. But I just remember us like being surprised because we hadn't really heard about the fact there was going to be movement, and we looked up and it was on their agenda, and it had kind of been introduced, and that's really important. I do think the other piece of that too is just like the national movement around infrastructure, in particular water infrastructure, over the last year, and really big part of that being being a big focus of the Biden administration. I think that really helped it just kind of take off because you started seeing Illinois being like the poster child for like being on the cusp of a crisis unless we fix it, right? So like you were saying, like, known lead service lines potentially being, known lead service lines being around 700,000, potentially being more than 1 million, being far and away above any other state. Like Illinois kind of became this focal point of these national conversations. I mean, we've seen, we began to see Illinois pop up in New York Times, on CNN, and The Hill and Guardian, and all these stories begin to pop up locally and nationally that I think the legislature just couldn't avoid. I remember one period in particular where we were having our stakeholder meeting with stakeholders, and as mentioned, some of them were tense and we couldn't get on the same page, but there was it was that Sunday, like a Chicago Tribune article had ran about Illinois' longstanding problem with lead service lines and needing to be tackled now. And so all the stakeholders, some of who had kind of been pushing back and a bit holding up the process, it was like, man, this is front page, front and center. And they're pointing at, municipalities and political leaders as a reason as to why there hasn't been movement on it. I feel like there was just a lot of attention that we couldn't have, planned for or even imagined that kind of uplifted those issues in ways that, was certainly unexpected to me, particularly like those media opportunities, a national kind of spotlight on the issue. Water broadly, but in particular Illinois, was really helpful.
Yeah, and I think another part of the conversation too, right, was as President Biden was coming into office, right, there was a lot of conversation about an infrastructure package, an infrastructure bill, right, that eventually became the bipartisan infrastructure framework, and the promise of, or not the promise, but the potential for, $15 billion ultimately in dedicated funding to replace lead service lines, I think was certainly on people's minds, right? That there would potentially be a dedicated federal funding source for this issue.
Yeah. And I remember that, like our messaging around that began to shift to, this money's coming. Are you going to be ready for it? Right? Are you going to be ready to receive this money and put these federal dollars to work immediately, or are you going to wait until these dollars come and be behind the eight ball and try to figure out how you're going to distribute these funds and utilize them? And I think that was really helpful, like in that as well. Like of all the different things that we've kind of talked about, some that were in our control, some that were outside of it, what would you say, if you had to pick one, was maybe the single biggest kind of factor in helping pass this legislation?
I think that's another really tough question, and I might instead of saying what I think the biggest one is, I'll pick one and then I'll ask you what you think. For me, I think one big piece of it was really the research case we made, right? That we could demonstrate that this was a problem statewide, that we could demonstrate that this was disproportionately affecting communities with high percentages of people of color living in them, right? Like, I think that was really powerful to be able to confirm that, right? And I think these are things that the environmental justice community has known for a long time, right? And I think our ability to really put data to that was tremendously helpful. And I think, and if I step back and I go back a little bit in time, right, that was made possible by a bill that was passed in 2016 in Illinois requiring every community in Illinois to inventory their service lines and report the number of known lead service lines in their community, right? And I think that having that inventory and being able to say, yes, this is a problem statewide and we know where, was really big. And, we could talk about the refinements that are needed to that inventory, right? But at the end of the day, that's huge. And I actually don't know. And I wonder if Jeremy, how many other states have statewide lead service line inventories? Do you know?
I don't. There aren't a ton, though. I know there's a reference document that exists out there. I think EDF may have produced it a couple years ago, but there weren't. There weren't a ton, and especially not inventoried in a meaningful way. So probably realistically, probably a handful.
Yeah. What do you think were one or some of the made the biggest difference?
I think for me, I think the most important piece, or one of the most important pieces that helped, really get this was, and I think it's tied to kind of the research case, particularly around equity and justice on this, was taking a step back and getting it right. Right. And I think when I mentioned, the bill that got introduced kind of around during the close of a session, and we ended up, pausing it to wait till the next session and really go after it. But it was at that point where, I don't know if you remember, we had a conversation kind of right after Christmas where, we had talked to, and shout out to our amazing colleague, Colleen Smith, who was at Illinois Environmental Council at the time, who really helped lead the political aspect of this work. But I think all three of us met and we had a conversation that it was essentially, hey, we can pass this older version of the bill as is, right? Probably pretty easily. It won't have any teeth to it. Won't have any kind of equity and justice components to it. But we can get something on the books, or we can take a step back, tell them let's kick it to next session. Let's really redraft it to make sure that equity is accounted for in here. And that's what we chose. We said, no, let's do it right? Let's do it equitable, and let's make sure that communities are protected, communities are centered in this work and centered in this bill and moving forward, and not to have a say in it. And I think to me that was one of the most significant portions, because it was at this nexus of, okay, do we just want to kind of pass something just to get it passed, or do we want to really, focus in? And I think it was us taking the time to get that equity, to make sure that equity was in front and center in the bill, that then allowed more stakeholders and more partners to say, yeah, I'm in, I'm supported, I'm willing to go to bat for it. We're willing to make the calls. We're willing to do the testimonies. We're willing to send the emails. We're willing to send out to our membership. And I think that was really helpful in making the difference there, was taking the time to make sure that equity was centered, because that then allowed more folks to say, this is something that we can get behind and push. I think that was a significant portion of it. Um, as we kind of begin to wind down, what would you say is like what's next, right, for the implementation of this bill? You mentioned, at the beginning of the year, there were some provisions that already kind of kicked in, right? The banning of partial lead service line replacements. Now, also being required to do lead service line replacement alongside water main replacement. But what's next for kind of the meat of implementation and getting this work done? And then two, like, how do you think, like, what are some ways that a bill like this then creates other opportunities for water infrastructure, presently or in the future?
Yeah. So, I think that some of the biggest parts of what's next is how do we make sure that every community, every household has the financial and technical resources they need to have their lead service line replaced, right? And, I think on the one hand, that's making sure there's enough money, right? So, again, the bipartisan infrastructure bill had $15 billion in dedicated lead service line replacement funding, which, Illinois' share of that is going to be significant, right? But it's not going to be enough to address the problem in Illinois. So Illinois is slated to receive somewhere in the range of $560 million through the bipartisan infrastructure framework for lead service line replacement. The cost of replacing all of Illinois' lead service lines is likely going to be somewhere north of $6 billion, right? So we need to figure out how to fund that and make sure we're funding it without breaking the backs of low-income Illinoisans. So that's going to be a big part. Is how do we make sure that there's enough funding available? The other big part is making sure that utilities and communities and households have the resources they need to take advantage of that funding, right? And part of that is going to be making sure that there are some transparent and equitable criteria in place for distributing whatever funding exists. Part of it's going to be making sure that utilities have the technical capacity they need to implement lead service line replacement in their communities, because we know there are communities in Illinois and throughout the country who may not have the staff or technical expertise needed to really do this work, and we want to see those communities succeed. So how do we set up those systems? And then finally, it's going to be making sure that property owners have the information they need in order to make the best choice for them about lead service line replacement, and make sure that the only thing to make sure that they're not just thinking about the cost of a replacement, that they have some financial assistance, that they're thinking about long-term property values and health effects if they leave that lead service line in the ground, making sure they have information to make good decisions. So that's one big part of it, right, is just like making sure those resources, financial and technical and information, are really in place. And I think that some of that ties pretty directly into a bigger conversation at the moment about how the state revolving fund programs are operating throughout the country. So the state revolving fund are a set of programs run by US EPA and then administered by individual states. And there's some evidence nationally that low-income communities of color are receiving fewer of the benefits of this really major infrastructure funding program. It's one of the primary ways that a lot of utilities finance major capital investments. And so how do you use lead service line replacement as a model for ensuring that the state revolving fund programs are also paying attention to those same equity issues and are also responsive to communities, right? They are now, right? But like, how do you improve those programs so that they're really reaching their fullest potential and reaching every community in need? And I think that's going to be a big challenge moving forward, right? And one that lead service line replacement really opens up.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think it can play out in a number of ways, but like the biggest takeaway from that is, making sure that we're doing work, in particular the infrastructure work, in an equitable way that ensures, especially the hardest hit communities, have access to clean, safe, affordable water, right? And this is part of it, and a big part of that is that piece of transparency, right? Like this work can't happen in a meaningful way without the level of transparency and commitment to equity that we need to do, right? And I think that's spot on, right? Like because the end result, right, or the end goal of all of this is to ensure that all people, regardless of race and income and anything else, that you have access to clean, safe water, right? And I think that's I think this lead service line replacement work in these conversations has lifted this up in a way that kind of centers water infrastructure to say, okay, it's lead right now, right? Cool, let's knock out lead, right? But while we're doing that, let's figure out what else we need to be working on as well to ensure that folks have this access to clean water.
I think that's such an important point, Jeremy, because I think, I mean, you know me, I'm a big wonk, right? And so I can get like really caught up in like the technical details, but I think it's so important to like retain focus on these bigger goals of I mean, lead service line replacement is part of it, right? But like what we're talking about is making sure that people have access to safe drinking water that, is in good repair and, like that they can afford. And like that's fundamentally what we're talking about, right? And I think it's so important to keep sight of that as we sometimes drift into these real, technical kind of wonky topics. So thank you for bringing us back to that.
Yeah, no, thank you, and I think that's a great way to kind of close out the show, right? With the end of this conversation, bringing it back to this point of centering equity, right? So that all folks have access to safe, sufficient, water in their homes. And so Justin Williams of Metropolitan Planning Council, thanks again for joining me, here, and thanks for all of your hard work on, getting this, this landmark legislation over the line in collaboration with so many partners on the ground. It's much appreciated, and I look forward to kind of the implementation.
Waterloop. Thank you for listening to this episode, and thanks again to Springpoint Partners for grant funding and to Hydroloop for sponsorship. Remember, you can support the Waterloop nonprofit media outlet at patreon.com/thewaterloop. To find all episodes, sign up for email updates, and connect on social media, visit waterloop.org. Waterloop, Waterloop, Waterloop.